Good morning in the United States of America and good afternoon in Europe. A very warm welcome to everybody joining this session of our transatlantic virtual series, Road to Election Night and Beyond. My name is David Deißner. I'm Atlantik-Brücke's Executive Director. Today's event is part of a joint initiative hosted by a vibrant network of organizations dedicated to transatlantic relations. And I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of our team and our partners, which include the American Council in Germany, the Aspen Institute Germany, the American Academy in Berlin, AmCham Germany, the Deutsche Atlantische Gesellschaft, and several renowned political foundations and institutions as Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, Heinz Seidel Stiftung, Heinrich Böll Stiftung, and Amerika House, and of course also Atlantik-Brücke. Again, a very warm welcome. Today's virtual discussion is entitled Knowing Each Other, Mutual Perceptions Across the Atlantic. In fact, we want to take a closer look at our German-American relationship and ask ourselves which larger trends, which long-term opportunities and challenges we can see in this relationship, a relationship that, without being dramatic, is being put to severe tests. And it is my great honor to welcome our special guests in our conversation, Ambassador Dr. Emily Haber and Ambassador John B. Emerson. Of course, our two speakers hardly need an introduction. Dr. Emily Haber has been German ambassador to the United States since June 2018. Prior to her Washington posting, Ambassador Haber was deployed to the Federal Ministry of the Interior, serving as State Secretary, overseeing security and migration at the height of the refugee crisis in Europe. In this capacity, she worked closely with the US administration already on topics ranging from the fight against international terrorism to global cyber attacks and cybersecurity. In 2009, she was appointed political director and in 2011, state secretary at the Foreign Office, the first woman actually to hold either post. Ambassador Haber, it's an honor to have you today on the call.
Thank you for inviting me.
Ambassador John Emerson was named chairman of the American Council on Germany in 2018. He is the vice chairman at Capital Group International. And previously, of course, and we all know him very well, he was US ambassador to Germany from 2013 to 2017. In 2015, Ambassador Emerson received the State Department's Sue M. Cobb Award for exemplary diplomatic service, an award given annually to one non-career ambassador. In 2017, the Secretary of the Navy and the Director of the CIA awarded him their highest civilian honors for his service. Before going to Berlin, he was the president of Capital Group Private Client Services from 1997 until 2013. And previously, he served on President Clinton's senior staff from 93 until 97 as Deputy Director of Presidential Personnel and subsequently as Deputy Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. In 2010, President Obama appointed Ambassador Emerson to serve on the President's Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations. Ambassador Emerson, dear John, it's great to have you too.
Thanks so much, David. And I always love being on a discussion with my dear friend, Ambassador Haber.
Wonderful. So great to have you, have both of you here today. Just one final housekeeping remark from my side. Our moderated discussion will last about 35 minutes, followed by 25 minutes of Q&A. So we do have more than 200 people here on the call at the moment. We would like you to make, please, use of the option to participate actively in our call. At the moment, all the participants' microphones and videos are muted by default. And of course, I won't have time to answer all the questions, but we try to include as many as possible. If you want to ask a question, please use the FAQ function in Zoom or the raise hand button. We can also put you on air on audio. So if you raise your hand with a raise hand button, I will try to include you. Now let's dive right into the topic. Ambassador Haber, if I may start with you. When we look back on the previous 3.5 years, it has been tough, to say the least. Has the German-American relationship suffered permanent damage, do you think? How stable is this transatlantic alliance in view of the still ongoing tensions in so many different policy fields?
Well, let's have a look at the perceptions first. What we do see is a growing divergence in how we view one another. A very recent Pew poll showed that about 26% of Germans looked at the United States in positive terms, and the comparable number for the United States tells us that 75% of Americans think favorably of Germany, and a recent Chicago Foreign Affairs Council poll showed that 67% of these Americans believed that they benefited from the transatlantic relationship. So the divergence is obvious. It's interesting that it seems to be linked to a growing sense, both in the United States and in Germany, that China as a challenge and as a priority is becoming more and more important. And actually here, the numbers match, and they seem to be linked to the respective view that we have of one another. Now, if I look at data samples, I always look at context, at expectations that are intrinsic. The history of expectation, the history of perceptions, the history of strategic thinking. They may not be reflected in the question that was asked, but they are very strongly anchored in the minds of those that respond to the question. And here I'd point to the following yardsticks. The first one is that we've seen over the past years a series of moves that were considered disruptive in Europe and intended as disruptive by the administration, withdrawals from international agreements or criticism of structures of regional governance or global governance and so forth. And making the point that these were partly deeply flawed institutions or regulations or rules or treaties that were actually damaging the prospects for the United States to pursue American interests. Now, I'm saying that because Germany obviously is one of the most globalized countries in the world. We are a medium-sized country, and we depend on rules and regulations and international organizations, flaws and all included, because we depend on the predictability and the transparency of them. It's our lifeline. So there has been, I think that is closely linked to the polls, because for Germany, the disruption means a growing sense of insecurity. We may be oftentimes too much wedded to the status quo, and therefore seeing less of a chance if we have a strong American partner at our side to address the flaws of international organizations. But that's neither here nor there. But I believe the insecurity, or less charitably said, being pushed out of the comfort zone may have contributed to the data that I have told you. Also, expectations. Look, the questions didn't reflect what is truly important in our relationship, and that is we are democracies. We are committed to rule of law. We are committed to values. We are committed to choices that we want to make. But that is something that is intrinsic. It wasn't reflected by the language of the questions, and it was so evident and ingrained in our thinking that it didn't come, that it wasn't reflected by the answer. And I think that's where the polls probably get the relationship wrong. And my last point is, we've seen monumental structural changes across the world in the international landscape, in the international geopolitical and geoeconomic architecture. That means that Europe for the United States will be less of a focus than it has been, let's say, 30 years ago. And new challenges have arisen. We've seen the huge rise of China, which poses new challenges as we see every day. And these changes will be mirrored in the change of the transatlantic relationship. Now, that's not a bad thing. Relationships are never static. They're constantly dynamic as contexts change, as environments change, and as threats change. We just need to be, we just need to learn to be comfortable with that.
John, are you still comfortable, or how much do these polls worry you? I mean, we also see that more and more Germans are kind of open to this idea of equidistance, also to other partners, say China in particular. Does that worry you? Is that a sign of alienation, or do you think that the polls get it wrong, as Ambassador Haber just said?
Well, I mean, I think there's no question that polls don't reflect the entirety of reality, as Ambassador Haber suggested. I would argue that the difference is largely because she's doing such a great job as ambassador, and that's why the numbers are up so high in the United States. But it's important for Germans to remember that we have gone through, as Emily just noted, we have gone through tough times before and come through them. You know, 6 weeks after I started, we had Handygate. You know, several years before that, we had the Iraq War. Back in a couple of decades before that, we had Pershing missiles. So we've gone through difficult and challenging times, even in the post-war era, in terms of our relationship. And we've always been able to change, move it back, modify, what have you. I will say this, and I'm not sure this view is shared by the current administration, but there is no question in my mind that a strong Germany and a strong Europe are very much in the national security interest and the international economic interest of the United States of America, very much in line with America first. And that is something that I think from a silver lining standpoint may emerge out of these difficult situations that we find ourselves in part because of tone and other things. You know, we're beginning to see Europe coalesce a bit more. I was honestly very impressed with, after being somewhat distressed with the way Europe was initially reacting to the pandemic, to see some of the changes adopted by the EU in terms of helping the other member states that aren't doing so well. I think the way Europe coalesced in the wake of Brexit and the Brexit vote, and obviously there's a tense negotiation ongoing right now in terms of what things are going to look like after December 31st of this year. And there's been a bit of a coalescing in response to some of the rhetoric and tone that's come from the United States. I don't think it's a bad thing if Europe, clearly with Germany's leadership, moves to a stronger and more independent, if you will, approach on a number of issues. The one point I would make is this, however. I do think, and Emily mentioned this as well, I do think it is really important, because of our shared values, that we stick together when it comes to doing things like trying to make sure that China plays by the rules and trades with a level playing field. When it comes to dealing with Russian interference in our electoral processes, when it comes to defending ourselves against cyber attacks from whether they're, jointly, whether they're generated by states or whether they're generated by non-state actors. And of course, when it comes to dealing with issues like climate change, which I think will become, get the focus it deserves again once we're through this pandemic. So, I don't want to see a complete decoupling of Europe and the United States, but I think it's good that Europe is making some decisions on its own and moving forward, maybe in a different direction from which the Americans might like. But what's really important is on these fundamental issues that we stick together and work together. And I put China at the top of that list.
Both of you actually mentioned the common set of values that we really share in that transatlantic partnership. I sometimes wonder, have maybe in particular the Germans kind of overstretched that value discourse a little bit too much? I mean, in foreign policy, we always have these two levels of discourse, right? We talk about interest, maybe mutual interest, maybe colliding interests, but also shared values. My impression, or our impression, here at Atlantik-Brücke often was that discourse, particularly when expressed from a German perspective, doesn't really resonate anymore. It can, it appears as if this is almost moralistic, or that the Germans want to teach the Americans. But, you know, have we, in particular the Germans, maybe focused a little bit too much about that rather abstract discourse of the liberal order values, rather than really looking for really concrete fields of cooperation and mutual interest? What would be your take on that?
I do think that sometimes when you just use values language as such, that it just goes like this, and it doesn't sound real. But it's very easy to talk about it from a standpoint of reality. It's about rule of law. It's about a commitment to a free democracy. It's about a commitment to a free press and to to democratic decisions being made by a fully engaged and fully informed electorate. And it's about human rights and our commitment to human rights. And I mean, when you make it specific, and particularly the rule of law piece, and I'd also say a level of transparency in commercial transactions, to look at the business relationship that we have. When you unpack values, then I think it actually has more resonance and more meaning to folks.
Thank you. Would you like to add on?
React to that too, because if you're right, David, if you actually say if we'd be lecturing, and you'd be right if we made human rights and values the exclusive linchpin of international politics. But diplomacy and international politics are usually very messy affairs. Values come in as they should, because that's about who we are and who we want to be, about human rights, the way we want the world to see. But interests come in as well, and history and experiences with third countries come in. And there's no hierarchy. They just exist side by side, and the hierarchy usually comes from context. That's probably a bit realpolitik, but that's how it works. Now, ignoring it, you see, I started my career in Moscow. I served in Moscow a couple of times, and the first time in the 1980s. And I do acutely remember how important it was that we actually stuck to the script of choices and rule of law and democratic values, because that informed not only the Soviet side, how far it could go, but it also defined the limit and the extent of inspiration we gave to others. Dropping that as a topic because we decide that it will lead us nowhere is actually leaving those alone that we would like to support, and telling other actors how far they can go in ignoring a popular dissent.
Thank you so much. Before we actually talk about the election, of course, everyone, probably many here in the call would like to hear your assessment of the campaign and how it's shaping up. Let me just ask one question in more general terms. What do you think should and has to be on the transatlantic agenda, regardless of the outcome of the election? What are the key priorities, maybe A, from a German perspective, and B, from a US perspective, for our transatlantic future, say, for the next 2 to 3 years? What really is, what are the key priorities from your perspective? Maybe Ambassador Harbour, you would like to start?
Well, the range of issues that are on the table, some of them are quite old, and we have to deal with them no matter what administration is in Washington. They come with a long story, from burden sharing to tariffs, to the Iranian dossier and so forth. So they're on the table and we'll have to deal with it. And actually we have a lot of experiences in navigating differences or managing them, or even solving and arguing out our differences. One key question will be, and John alluded to it, and so did I, is how to actually deal with the international landscape of organizations, institutions, rules, and treaties. Now, mind you, the United States can well argue that it will be better off in asymmetric situations, because in every single bilateral situation it will prevail because it is the single most powerful country in the world. But no country is ever only in bilateral situations. And for a country like Germany, this rule doesn't apply anyway, because we would not be in a position to prevail when confronted with powers that are stronger than we are. For us, therefore, the European Union, that is a union of soon only 27, is a lifeline for standing our ground, for defending our interests, and for defending, well, what we want to be. So dealing with this, dealing with, I don't like the word very much, but dealing with multilateralism, which once again sounds very abstract and very prone to lectures. But dealing with that will be a key issue, is now and will be a key issue.
Thank you.
I would absolutely agree with that. And just to underscore the point, the advantage that we have over our adversaries, competitors, whatever phrase you want to use, like China, perhaps, like Russia, perhaps, the advantage we have is we actually have allies. Yes. We have allies and alliances that are based on long histories and shared values. And if I look at at both China and Russia, it's less allies and more transactional relationships that they have. And in point of fact, I think this idea that the United States is stronger if we just do mano a mano, bilateral negotiations, misses the point that sometimes 1 + 1 adds up to more than 2. And particularly if this is why I made the point earlier about China, if you're dealing with, a potential market of 1.5 billion people, as China is becoming more and more of a consumer market, and you've got 400 million in Europe and 300+ million in the United States, we are going to be, and we have similar ideas about how we should approach trade, what rule of law means in that context. We're going to be doing a lot better if we confront that jointly, and particularly if we can engage Japan, South Korea, and others. This, by the way, was the idea of the TPP negotiations obviously Europe wasn't a piece of that. They were a part of TTIP, but that was the idea. And then ultimately you set this framework and say, okay, China, you want to play, you got to play by these rules. So I think the commitment to multilateralism, and it does need to change. And by the way, folks, burden sharing is not going away with a new president. In point of fact, it was first raised by Barack Obama, who, helped negotiate along with the chancellor and others, the 2% commitment at the 2014 Wales summit of NATO nations. So that's not going away. The idea that, Americans are a little tired about what's used as never-ending wars. I would say more accurately, it should be, it's not never-ending wars, it's more like a consistent commitment to a presence that enhances our national security. I think that's what the troops in Germany are. I think that's what the troops in Korea are. And in point of fact, what the work we are doing in Syria and some of the work we're doing in Afghanistan, they're getting tired of that. There's going to be a little bit less of that. I will say, let me just also address this issue of troops in Germany. The 35,000 or some odd troops that we have in Germany are not there to protect Germany. They are there to advance American interests. And that's not me speaking. That is directly quoting Ben Hodges, who was the 3-star general who ran USAR, U.S. Army Europe, during my time here. And they're there to be a part of a critical part of NATO and our increasingly joint interests as it relates to NATO and NATO missions. So I just wanted to put that on the table as well. But these will all be topics for discussion. Personally, I would love to see us get the trade situation right. We came very close with TTIP. We weren't able to bring it over the finish line. That is a big piece of unfinished business.
And if I may ask, sorry, yes, please.
Can I add to that point?
Yes, of course.
Just 2 things. One is, it's obvious to me that on all traditional bilateral issues where we disagree and that have either financial or economic implications, well, the economic crisis that we are confronted here with, and Europe is confronted with too, will probably limit the latitude for compromises. And I agree with John, burden sharing will be center stage. Because here I point to a data that I read over the weekend and that really concerned me. And this is from a poll conducted by the Chicago Council of Foreign Affairs. I mentioned it already. And it said that a majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats alike, were thought that troops should either partially or completely withdrawn by Germany. Now, this really caught my attention, and I called one of the first persons that was affiliated with the poll, and I asked him, "Why is that?" And are the data the same with regard to Korea and Japan? And the answer was no, it wasn't. And his explanation was that actually some of the narrative had got stuck. Some of the narrative that Germany was free riding and hey, why should we pay for the security of others if they don't pay? I'm not saying that this is the reality. I'm saying this is a narrative which apparently has taken roots. And that we will have to deal with by positions and handling security power projection by Germany. It will be a huge issue. And that is not only linked to numbers, it's linked to things we actually do, including with regard in our political relations with third countries. So I'd see our relationship with China and with Russia as part of a wider security policy too.
John, if I may, I would like to ask one, before we briefly address the campaign, I would like to ask one question to you as a businessman and a diplomat. Over recent years, actually, much to the dismay of the US, European companies, and especially German companies, have started to increasingly rely on the Chinese market. And it's an undeniable fact that the well-being of the German economy depends largely on exports to China. Now, at the same time, we see that the EU drastically adopted an aggressive stance against China in 2019, actually labeling it as an economic competitor, actually a systemic rival. So Germany is, obviously in a dilemma here. Do you think that, or from your perspective, do the Germans name their adversaries, their political adversaries, clearly enough? Or on which fronts do you think Europeans and Germans in particular have to make a clearer signal and that they are alongside the United States rather than China?
Well, I think it's really a question of being realistic. I was at a panel on a discussion on just this topic this past weekend up at Schloss Elmau, and and the whole topic about German businesses engaging with China was a topic of conversation. Obviously, it's not for the United States to say, you can or cannot, Audi, you can or cannot build another plant in China. But I think that German companies need to be realistic as they think about not just their short-term or even medium-term interests, but as they think about their long-term interests, because I guarantee you the Chinese are thinking about long-term interests. And in point of fact, the more you engage without insisting on the kinds of protections that will make sure that you don't see your intellectual property replicated and popping up 6 years later with a Chinese competitor that can now compete you at a lot cheaper prices. If you're not going into it with eyes open and taking, steps to make sure those precautions are in place, you and your shareholders will be sorry down the road. And so that's why I think, notwithstanding, obviously, obviously some of the tensions and the tone that makes things uncomfortable that exists. I just think ultimately it's important for Germany and the United States to sit down and figure out what we do agree on vis-a-vis China, what we can work in terms of reforming the WTO, for instance, and where we can bring pressure to bear. And to do it together, I think is in the interest of German businesses as much as it is of American businesses.
Ambassador Harbour, would you like to comment on that as well, role of China on the business sphere?
Well, with regard to China, I think we agree on a lot. We agree on the problems of enforced joint venture obligations, on level playing field, on intellectual property theft, on security risks, and so forth. That is true. We also agree that China and the much more muscular approach that China takes, it obviously has seen the crisis as opening space for a much more proactive and even aggressive behavior. That's a problem that we have to deal with. So we agree on the strategic challenge. We do today. Where we might have disagreements is on the underlying assumptions, which in turn are linked to the levels of ambition. I always ask myself what Americans actually mean if they talk about decoupling. Does it mean a partial rollback of value chains that proved to be risky in the pandemic, or do you actually want to cordon off part of the world economically? What is that? Is that the objective? And even if it's doable, is that going to produce more security? And is that going to, do you assume it's going to reverse or stop the rise of China? Now, if that's the underlying assumption, I would not agree. I think it goes far beyond the capacities that we have. We can not reverse or stop the rise of China, but what we can do and should be doing collectively is defining the environment in which the rise occurs and defining the terms of coexistence. And we can't do that alone. The United States can't do it alone. They need, and we need, as many partners as we possibly can have in order to address the practical problems at hand. And that's what we need to discuss. And the differences in the underlying assumptions are not a trivial thing.
Thank you so much. I would now like, I mean, this is a bit of a sudden move to another topic, but John, would you mind maybe sharing your thoughts on how the election campaign at the moment is shaking up? Of course, we are all, following that very closely, particularly, the debate.
I hadn't noticed.
Yes, well, after sadly Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away a couple of days ago, the debate has even gone in a new and different direction. How are you following that? We are not advocating here for either side or either outcome of the election, of course, but just as an analysis, how do you see the election campaign shaping up?
Well, clearly I've been at presidential politics since the 1980s, and this is unquestionably the most unusual presidential election, certainly in my lifetime. Obviously we have the pandemic, we've got the economic crisis brought about by the policy response to the pandemic. We have a national conversation on race and racial injustice in America. And then you slap on top of that a Supreme Court fight in the 6 weeks run up to the election. And I just make 3 quick points. Number one, I think a useful frame for people to sort of understand what's happening in the election is to look at the frame that both parties are clearly trying to bring to this campaign, as fairly well articulated during the course of their 2 conventions in late August. So Joe Biden wants this to be a referendum on Donald Trump and how he has handled these 3 crises that we're facing, the pandemic, economic crisis, and this national conversation on race. And by the way, up until now, the American public has sort of seen it that way, which is why Biden tends to be leading Trump in the polls. The Trump campaign's job is to make this a choice. Well, you may not like what Donald Trump has been doing, but let me tell you something. It's either Trump, who's really good on the economy, and we're going to need to rebuild our economy. And that, by the way, is the only area where he consistently outpolls Joe Biden. And this other guy, Joe Biden, is just awful. And what they've noticed is a lot of their attacks on Biden really haven't stuck. So now the attack on Biden is to say, if Biden's president, it's not really going to be Biden, it's going to be Bernie Sanders and AOC calling the shots. And so things like defund the police, open borders, that you hear from the far left, they're trying to put on top of Biden. And what happened so this is the fight, referendum versus choice. And what happened with the, very sadly, the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is it has clearly put this election into the choice column, because you are now seeing consequences one way or the other. And historically, social conservatives in America, the religious right, a Supreme Court fight is rocket fuel for them when it comes to turnout. And unfortunately, the left complains about it and is upset about it, but we haven't seen that comparable level of turnout. So that's something that I think in the short term may play to Donald Trump's advantage, believe it or not. Second point, ignore the national polls. I mentioned them earlier, but ignore them. As a reminder, what matters is 6 or 7 states. That's going to determine the winner of the Electoral College. And in our terribly bifurcated partisan political process, there's a very narrow vote of swing voters, essentially educated people who live in the suburbs, often mostly women. Educated women who live in the suburbs is the sort of one swing voter demographic. So the campaign, and you get this from the rhetoric of both sides, is for sure they're trying to boost base turnout, their base voters, and then they're trying to get as much of that narrow slice of swing voters as they possibly can. And then the third point everybody needs to keep in mind is this is not election day on November 3rd, it is election weeks. Mm-hmm. Why? Because as a result of the pandemic, you're going to have, normally it's about 25% of voters vote by mail. You're going to have over 60% of people voting by mail in this election. And the way vote by mail works is you get I do this all the time in California, you get your ballot, 3 to 4 weeks ahead of time. So, by the way, in some states, people are already voting. So election day starts much earlier. And the reason I say it's election weeks is it's also going to last a lot longer than election night. Why is that? Because in most vote by mail regimens, and by the way, we have 50 of them because every state has a different system for this. If the ballot is mailed in and postmarked by the Postal Service on or before election day, it counts. So if you have close elections in some of these swing states, and remember that Wisconsin and Michigan, for instance, Hillary Clinton lost by less than 10,000 votes in those states. You have a close election on election day, you may have tens of thousands of ballots that are coming in the week or so after election day, and those need to be counted. And just to put a final little complicating factor on it, 70% of Democrats say they're likely to vote by mail, and less than 50% of Republicans say they're likely to vote by mail. They'd rather vote on election day. In many states, the election day ballots get counted first before the ballots that are mailed in. Some of them, they count them as they come in, but in many states, including Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, by the way, 2 of the swing states, they don't count them until they've done the election day ballot, which means that on election night, there will be a disproportionate number, or the number of Republican votes will be disproportionately higher than what the overall electorate in that state is, and the number of Democratic votes will be disproportionately lower, which means we may be in a circumstance where it looks like a Republican candidate, whether it's for the Senate or for the presidency, has won on election night, but day after day as ballots get counted, the Democrat comes on to at least make it closer, perhaps even win those states. That will be a mess, let me just tell you.
Nonetheless, we all hope for a fair and peaceful election period. As you said, so actually no reason to stay up all night, right? I mean, we will do it anyway, but just have to be patient. Thank you so much to both of you until now. I would now include some of the questions that have reached us here through the chat function. Maybe the first question asked by Matthew Koniecznik from Politico. He asks, referring to the election, the support of many German politicians and officials across the political spectrum for Joe Biden has left the impression among many Republicans that Germany has become a partisan national actor. What effect do you think that could have on Germany's standing in Washington in the long term?
Well, I expect this is for the German ambassador to answer.
I hope you feel comfortable answering it.
No German diplomat will ever take sides because it's not our job. It's a job of voters who elect a government and a president and Congress in a democracy. Full stop. That's where we are.
That was a very clear and short answer. Thank you so much. John, would you like to comment on that?
No, I mean, I think Emily put it properly. You know, look, in all of our countries, you have people who are favorites. I mean, Angela Merkel is probably more popular in the United States than she is in Germany, although maybe not now because she's done such a good job with the COVID crisis. But you know, that happens. And I think as the ambassador put it, you know, the key is how are you interacting with one another? And I'll tell you, we were assiduously staying away from you know, any sense of playing favorites in German politics as well. You just need to do that.
Thank you. So we are now meandering a little bit among, you know, all these different topics. I hope that's okay. Another question by James Bindernagel. He asks, can the debate on the 2% burden sharing debate narrative change to one of burden shifting if Europeans take more responsibility for their security through NATO logistics, MENA relations, and develop PESCO, EDF, CRRD, etc. Rather than 2%, capabilities can shift the burden as seen from the US. Is there a new narrative based on Europe taking more responsibility?
Well, I expect that's also for me. I think that's a very valid point. Frankly, the 2% have always been some sort of iconic chiffre for engagement, but they were never. They're not set in stone as if this was the only thing. Just look at it this way. Now that we see the economic downturn, of course, the relative share and burden sharing simply by dint of the shrinking GDP is growing. Now, was that intended back in Wales? Certainly not. What was intended was that European countries took over a greater share of responsibility, defense-wise, military-wise, mission-wise, etc., than they did before. And they did it as a response to a massive intrusion in our European neighborhood, in our geography. So that's a fact. We should actually look at outcomes, and we should look at voids that emerge as the number of challenges grow, and not only in our own neighborhood. So I think what you described, which would also probably imply a greater European centrality in NATO, is a response to the shifting security landscape, and it's the way ahead. The exclusive focus on burden sharing. I'm not dodging the issue. I think we should, promises are made, and if you make promises, you keep them. But the focus alone is really not getting the problem that we are confronted with.
Yeah, JD, I would agree with that. As you know, during our time as well in Germany and Berlin, the push was really on the substance of what you addressed, of what Emily's talking about. It was the 2% is just sort of one of many means of getting there. And I think this focus on it risks elevating form over substance, which is something I think we all have to be cautious of. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. That's where we need to get, and that's what's important.
Mm. Thank you. Another question by one of our participants, Tobias Schwartz. He asks actually two questions. The first one is, how much of the current underlying, not just tone, problems in transatlantic relations can be attributed to America not being able to properly discount a future in which it can no longer largely set the global rules for the game and needs a level playing field itself? That's the first question. And the second one is referring to the internal or domestic situation in the US. How much does the social division in the US limit its ability to act strategically, short, medium, long term?
Well, why don't I take the second question, and Ambassador Haber can take the first. I think it, you know, I actually think the social division in the United States is reflective of the fact that we've never fully and properly confronted our history in a way that, honestly, in the way that took a couple of generations to get there, but in the way Germany's been doing with regard to the Holocaust. And these are issues and challenges that have been with us for a long time, that will probably continue to be with us for a long time until we really do step up and adequately confront it. So, I mean, I don't see it as being debilitating in the sense of our international relations. I do see it as something that is increasingly having an impact in not just our domestic politics, but the way we live our lives. I was absolutely struck. If you had told me, you know, 3-4 months ago that you would see every major company in America engaging in a diversity and inclusion initiative, that you'd see literally conversations within corporate America about embracing the concepts of Black Lives Matter, I would have said, you know, what happened to make that come about? So it's a pretty extraordinary thing, and I think ultimately will be very positive for us if we stay on it and don't just give it lip service and then forget about what the real issue is here.
Mm.
Well, on the first question, if I understood it correctly, the question was, is the current tonality in international affairs a reflection of an international landscape that has changed to America's and the West's disadvantage? And well, I don't know. I can always analyze how things happen, but why and what the psychological triggers are, that's very difficult to define. I'd say this: there's a broad understanding that America has been overextended militarily. Once again, returning to the Chicago Foreign Affairs poll, I thought it was interesting that a strong majority, 67%, said the transatlantic relationship benefits the United States. But there was also a large sense that in military terms, there was too much exposure. So that will reflect not only this what this administration does, it will also inform the policy decisions of another administration. That will certainly, at least, it's what what the campaign publicly says, would choose a different tonality, but the structural triggering reasons for making decisions to bring people home, that will be there in any event, because it's taken roots in the constituents in a large part of the electorate.
Thank you. We actually have a number of questions, all, you know, again referring to the election and the handing over of power, and many questions go in the same direction, asking, do you think that that this transition of power will be peaceful? You know, we have talked about common values, and of course, you know, the democratic value of a fair and peaceful election is certainly a democratic value. John, how do you see it? Despite the fact that this might be a mess and will all take very long, do you think, you know, what would be scenarios? Can it actually be that messy that we see a real disruption here in that process of handing over power, and that maybe, you know, the incumbent president might not see a reason to leave?
Well, look, there are all sorts of wargaming going on. You know, the Brennan Center at NYU just had an exercise about what could happen. What if the president doesn't leave or whatever? I tend to think a lot of that's pretty overwrought. I do worry about a period of time when we're trying to count ballots. You have a president who's already laying the groundwork for saying that vote by mail is fraudulent and can't be trusted, and the election's being stolen, and so on and so forth. And you could have on the streets sort of a potentially volatile mix of people out there. But I think by and large, you'll see people peacefully protesting. You may have incidents of, tragically, of violence, as we've seen in the past months, but those are very limited incidents of violence. By and large, these protests have been, you know, huge, massively peaceful. And I honestly think, if this election is over and it's clear that Donald Trump has lost, even if it's messy getting to that point, he's going to leave. And we've had statements from people like Mitch McConnell and even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that suggest no role for the military here. Mitch McConnell made it clear, we always have, and we will honor the results of the election. I think if it's clear that he lost, it'll be very, very hard for him to stick around. And I think he'll go off and create the Trump Broadcasting Network and continue to be a force in American politics, honestly. But I think the only question I would have is actually whether he would show up at the inaugural. I think that might be a legitimate question. But as to, is he going to leave? Yes. And of course, I really have to be careful about speaking about the Constitution, because my old constitutional law professor, Gerhard Casper's on the phone on this Zoom here. But as I understand it, under the Constitution, as of now, it's January 20th, that you are no longer president at noon. You kind of turn into a pumpkin at that point. And so there's probably not the way Gerhard would have described it, but I really don't think that's a risk.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of minutes left. I don't want to keep you for too long, but there's still a large number of questions. Here's a fun one. What would be the top 2 topics on the agenda of the first post-election call between Chancellor Merkel and either A, President Trump, or B, President Biden? Maybe let's vary the question a little bit, so it might be easy for you to answer. What should be on the agenda of that first phone call?
Well, Emily, why don't you go first? What would you like to see on the agenda?
Well, the first topic would be congratulations to the winner of the elections, as is practice. I think the next topic should be that both sides need to come together as quickly as possible to define the 3 or 4 areas on which we would like to move forward. We've mentioned some of them already. And in order to produce early and visible results, that would be important for the bilateral relationship. And certainly dealing with China is among them.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I think if it's President Biden, obviously beyond the congratulations, my guess is there would be a desire to, if not come over personally to Germany shortly thereafter. We do have the Munich Security Conference coming up, which Vice President Biden attended a number of times and Senator Biden attended a number of times. But if not coming over to Germany quickly, certainly having senior members of the White House and the administration come over to begin to work quickly on that framework that Ambassador Haber just suggested would be a topic of conversation in that first phone call. I think we need to get to work quickly. Let's do it.
So, of course, we would like to end this call on a positive note, and I would like to ask both of you to tell us and to tell our audience, why committed transatlanticists can be hopeful for the next years. What would be your kind of positive outlook for transatlantic partnership? Why is there still, reason to be hopeful with regard to this historical partnership? John, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I'm looking at this list of participants. You have over 350 people here, people on both sides of the Atlantic, many of whom are friends of mine, friends of ours. And that to me is indicative of the extraordinary, not just interpersonal, but institutional relationships that have been knitted together and over the years, over the decades, in the wake of the Second World War. And that relationship that we have built and the institutions that we have created to sustain and grow that relationship have been largely responsible for an extraordinary, probably unprecedented period of growth and prosperity in our respective worlds. And I see absolutely no reason for that not to continue. You know, the fact that you've got 60 million Americans with German heritage, the fact that, you know, most Americans, if you ask them to identify a foreign leader, they can probably only name 3 or 4 people. It would be certainly Putin, probably Xi, and Angela Merkel, maybe Macron, but that's pretty much about it. And if you ask them who they think the top world leader is, it's going to be Angela Merkel. I mean, Americans love Germany, and Germans, maybe it's not reflected in the polls because of these tones and all that, but I think there's a fundamental sense of connectivity to the United States. So it's in our interest. It makes sense in terms of our shared values, and we are continuing to build upon the personal relationships that will ultimately sustain it. So I actually feel pretty good about it.
Thank you.
I look at the time we're living through as a period of transition. Now, if I discuss the transatlantic relationship, many of my interlocutors seem to think that this is a very static affair, but in truth, our bilateral relationship has changed a lot over the years. Germany was a pariah in the beginning. It changed when it slowly re-entered the international community supported by the United States. Then in the early 70s, there were indications of a more independent foreign policy. All of that came with fits and starts and then reunification. And it hasn't basically changed over the last 30 years. So perhaps the sense of disruption we see, and it happens for a reason, it happens for the structural paradigm shift in the international architecture, may produce a new balance in the relationship. And as John pointed out, he pointed out all the intense fabric of our relations. In 1989, when I was working at the Soviet desk, I remember that Gorbachev came to Germany, and the streets were lined with people full of enthusiasm. They were applauding, etc. And it was incredible. And I thought at the time, I had an eerie feeling because I thought, how is that going to translate into all this euphoria? How is that going to spell out? And it became pretty much clear that because this fabric did not exist, problems would loom much larger. But in the transatlantic relationship, we have the close interwoven links and fabrics and webs of contacts that will exist no matter what. Whether we disagree about Nord Stream or burden sharing, it exists. And I think that is, along with my first observation, that transitions happen and we'll have to adapt. It's normal.
Thank you so much to both of you for leaving us with this glimpse of hope. This is really what we need in these days. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our listeners. First of all, really thank you, Ambassador Emily Haber, for taking the time for joining our call. Thank you so much, Ambassador John Emerson. It was a great honor having you both. We really covered a lot of ground. Thank you for your differentiated and thoughtful remarks. Analyses. It was great to have you, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue with both of you, of course. Of course, looking forward to continuing this series that is called Road to Election. So looking forward to the next episode. Thank you again to all our listeners, and good evening.
Thanks for having us.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.